The locket was small and gold, and I had never seen it before in 13 years of marriage. I almost set it aside with his cufflinks and tie clips, the small box of a man's odds and ends that you sort through, eventually, after he is gone. Then my thumb found the tiny hinge, and it sprang open in my hand, and there was no photograph inside. Only an engraving, a few words cut deep into the gold. I read them sitting on the floor of my dead husband's closet, and the floor of my marriage fell out from under me. I want to tell you what that physical moment was actually like, because grief and shock do strange things to the body. I had been calm all morning, methodical, folding and sorting, dry-eyed in the way you get after a year of practice. And then the locket opened, and the words appeared, and I felt a cold drop straight through the center of me, the way you feel when a car brakes hard. My hands went unsteady. I read the 4 words maybe 10 times, as if they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense, into a name I recognized, into anything but a stranger's eternal promise hidden in my husband's things. They did not rearrange. They sat there in the gold, calm and permanent, and I sat on the floor with them, and the careful widow I had been all morning simply came apart. The engraving said, "Forever yours, Maren," and underneath it, a date. And I sat there holding it, because in 13 years with my husband, I had never once heard the name Maren. I need you to understand how complete that absence was, because it is part of what made the moment so disorienting. In 13 years, you learn the names that matter to a person, the old friends, the college roommate, the first boss, the high school sweetheart everyone has. I knew Aaron's whole cast of characters. I had heard the stories 100 times, and in all of it, across 13 years of dinners and road trips and late-night talks, the name Maren had never once been spoken. Not as a friend, not as an ex, not as a footnote. She had been edited out so completely that the gap did not even show. You cannot notice the absence of a name you have never heard. And now, here she was, the most thoroughly absent person in my husband's entire history, engraved in gold and promising him forever. The most hidden thing is not the thing that is talked about carefully. It is the thing that is never mentioned at all. Forever yours. To a woman I had never heard of, on a date I would soon work out was from before I ever met him. I checked that date a dozen times, doing the arithmetic against the year Aaron and I had met, as if getting the math wrong would make it bearable. But the math was simple, and it was a mercy I could not see yet. The date was years before me. Whatever this was, it had happened in a part of his life I had never been part of. My husband had carried that locket, in secret, through our entire life together. And I want to tell you the truth about what was inside it, because what I feared, sitting on that closet floor, turned out to be almost the exact opposite of what was real. My name is Allison Mercer, Allie. I am 37 years old, and I work as a registered dietitian in Salt Lake City, Utah. I spend my days helping people understand what is actually nourishing them, which I will let stand as its own small irony, given what I had to learn this year about what had actually been feeding my marriage. My husband Aaron died a little over a year ago. I am going to tell you who Maren was. But first you have to understand the 13 years that locket seemed, for one terrible afternoon, to call into question. Because the strange thing about a discovery like mine is that it does not only threaten the future you have lost, it reaches backward and threatens the past you thought you had. When Aaron died, I lost the years we would have had. That grief I understood. It is the ordinary grief of any widow. But the locket threatened something I had assumed was untouchable. The 13 years we had already lived. The years that were supposed to be safely mine no matter what came next. For one long afternoon, it seemed those years might not have been what I believed either, that I might lose not only my husband's future, but my husband's past. The whole record retroactively rewritten by 4 words in a drawer. That is a particular terror, to feel your own memories become unsafe. So this is not only a story about what I found. It is a story about getting my own marriage back, the real one, after a single object nearly took it from me a second time. Aaron and I were married for 13 years. He died at 41. It was sudden, an illness that moved fast and took him in a matter of weeks, and at 36, I became something I had never imagined being so young. A widow. And I will tell you about our marriage, because the marriage is what made the locket so devastating. It was a good marriage. Not a perfect one, no real one is, but a genuinely warm, close, attentive one. Aaron was the kind of husband who noticed things. He remembered the small stuff. He treated ordinary Tuesdays like they were worth something. He was, in a way I did not fully appreciate until I understood the locket, almost unusually grateful for our life, present in it, unwilling to waste it, the kind of man who would stop in the middle of a regular evening and say he was glad. People used to comment on it, actually. Friends would say, half joking, that they wished their husbands looked at them the way Aaron looked at me. My own sister once said that being around the two of us made her believe in marriage again. I took it as a compliment to us, to our chemistry, to some lucky match of temperaments. I never once wondered why my husband specifically was like that, why he, of all the decent, ordinary men in the world, had this particular gift for treating a life as precious. I assumed some people are just born knowing how to love well. I know now that almost no one is born knowing it. It is taught, and the teachers are usually losses. I never doubted, for one day of those 13 years, that I was loved completely. That is the marriage I had. That is the marriage that a small gold locket on a closet floor seemed to turn into a lie. There is one thing Aaron used to do that I want to tell you about, because it will matter later. On no particular occasion, not a birthday, not an anniversary, just a regular weeknight, he would sometimes reach over at the dinner table or in the car and take my hand and say, simply, "I'm really glad it's you." That was the whole sentence. I used to find it sweet and slightly funny, this habit he had of announcing his contentment out of nowhere. I teased him for it. I never once asked where it came from, because it never occurred to me that a thing so warm could have a source, let alone a sad one. I thought it was just Aaron. I would learn this past year that almost nothing about how a person loves is just them. It comes from somewhere. His came from a place I knew nothing about. I found it about a year after he died. Grief has its own slow clock, and it took me that long to be able to face the last of his things. The closet, the small personal box on the shelf, the leftover sediment of a person's life. I was not searching for anything. I was just doing the terrible, ordinary work of sorting. And the locket was simply there, at the bottom of the box, under the watch he never wore and a few old coins. It was clearly old, the gold a little worn at the edges, plainly something he had had for a long time. That was the first thing that did not fit, and I noticed it even before I opened it. Everything else in that box was from our life. The watch I had given him for an anniversary, coins from a trip we took, a tie clip that had been his father's and that I recognized. This was the one object that did not belong to any story I knew. It was older than our marriage, worn from years of being touched, and it had been kept apart from everything else, at the very bottom, the way you keep the one thing you do not want found on top. I should have understood, just from where it was sitting, that I had reached the part of my husband I had never been shown. I did not recognize it at all, which was itself strange. I knew my husband's things. And when I opened it and found no picture, just the engraving, my first feeling was confusion, and my second feeling, arriving fast and cold, was something much worse. Because here is where the mind goes. I sat on that floor and the questions came in a flood, and every one of them was a knife. Who was Maren? Forever yours. Those are not casual words. Those are the words of a promise, of a deep love. Why did my husband own a locket engraved with another woman's eternal devotion? Why had I never heard her name in 13 years? Why was it hidden? Had there been someone, all along, underneath our good marriage? A woman he had loved, maybe still loved, maybe had never let go of? I sat there and felt 13 years of certainty turn liquid. The attentiveness I had treasured, the gratitude, the way he held our ordinary life so carefully, was all of that real, or had I been living beside a man whose heart had always been partly somewhere else, with a Maren I had never known existed? I want to be honest. In those first hours, I grieved my marriage all over again because I was certain the locket meant it had not been what I thought. I did the thing you should never do alone at night with a closet floor and a terrible discovery. I started rereading my whole marriage backward through the lens of the locket. That weekend years ago when Aaron had gone quiet and I never knew why, had that been about her? The way he sometimes looked, for half a second, somewhere far away, before coming back to me with a smile, had that been her? Every small, unexplained mood across 13 years lined up obediently and offered itself as evidence for the prosecution. This is what a frightened heart does with a single ambiguous fact. It goes back through the entire record and reconvicts. By the time the sun came up, I had built, out of one engraved locket and a sleepless night, an entire secret marriage I had supposedly been living beside without knowing. None of it, it would turn out, was true. But at 4 a.m, all of it felt like memory. I did not sleep. And the next day, I did the only thing I could think to do. I called the one person alive who had known Aaron longer than I had. I called his mother. I called Carol. Carol is in her 70s, and she had buried her son a year before, and I knew I was about to ask her something that might open a door she had kept closed. I almost did not make that drive. There is a particular cowardice that comes with this kind of fear, the sense that as long as you do not ask the question out loud, the worst answer cannot become official. I could have put the locket back in the box, closed the closet, and gone on with a small, permanent splinter of doubt, rather than risk a confirmation that would change everything. For a few hours that morning, I genuinely considered it. But I had spent the night building a secret marriage out of one engraved trinket, and I understood that the not knowing would eat me alive far faster than any truth could. So, I got in the car. I drove to my mother-in-law's house with the locket in my pocket, gripping the wheel, rehearsing a question I was terrified to hear answered. But I could not live another day not knowing. I drove to her house, and I put the locket on her kitchen table, open, the engraving showing, and I asked her, "Who is Maren?" And Carol looked at the locket, and her face did something complicated. Not guilt, not alarm. Something more like a long-delayed sadness finally being allowed to arrive. And she said, "Oh, Allie, he kept it. I always wondered if he kept it." And then she told me about Maren. Maren was a girl Aaron had loved when he was very young. Before me, long before me, the date in the locket was from when Aaron was 22 years old, nearly 2 decades ago, years before he and I ever met. They had been young and serious, Carol told me, the first great love of his life, the kind that happens once at that age, total and certain. They had been talking about a future. He had given her that locket. She had given it back to him engraved, "Forever yours, Maren," the way young people in love make their promises permanent. And then, when Aaron was 22, Maren had died. Carol did not dwell on how, and I did not need her to, only that it was sudden and senseless, and the kind of loss that does not happen to people that young in any fair world. Aaron had been, Carol said, completely destroyed by it. For a long time after, she had genuinely feared for him, feared he would never come back from it. The bright, grateful, present man I had married had once been a young man flattened by a grief most of us do not face until we are much older. I tried, sitting in Carol's kitchen, to picture him at 22, the age in the locket. I had photographs of Aaron young. We all collect a few of those once we marry someone. But I had always looked at them as cute artifacts of a person I would meet later. Now I looked at them, in my memory, as portraits of a young man standing at the edge of the worst year of his life and not yet knowing it. The Aaron in those pictures still had Maren. He still had the future they had engraved into a locket. He did not yet know that within a few years he would be living back in his childhood bedroom, hollowed out, his mother frightened for his life. I had married the man who came out the other side of that. I had never even met the one who went in, and he had carried the locket, the only thing of that promise that remained, quietly for the rest of his life, including all 13 years of his life with me. Carol told me that afternoon things about her son's early 20s that I had never known, a whole chapter of Aaron's life that had simply been closed before I arrived in it. She told me how he had stopped eating for a while after Maren died, how he had moved back home, how a young man who had always been steady and warm had gone somewhere dark and stayed there for the better part of 2 years. She told me she had truly wondered whether the Aaron she had raised was gone for good. And then, slowly, he had come back. Not the same, she said, never quite the same, but back. And I sat in her kitchen realizing that I had married a man who had already lived through and survived the worst thing I could imagine, years before I ever shook his hand, and that I had never known it. The man I thought I knew completely had a whole continent inside him that he had quietly kept off every map he ever showed me. I asked Carol, before I left her kitchen that day, whether she thought I should have known, whether Aaron had been wrong to keep it from me all those years. And she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I have held on to. She said, "I don't think there's a right answer to that, Allie. He did the loving thing the only way he knew how. Maybe a braver man would have told you and trusted you to hold it. But you have to understand, the boy who lost Maren swore he would never make another woman feel like a runner-up. Keeping that locket in a drawer instead of in your marriage was, in his mind, how he kept that promise to you. He wasn't protecting a secret, he was protecting you from one." And I drove home turning that over, and I have not stopped. The strange truth that the same silence can be a betrayal or a kindness, depending entirely on what is behind it. Behind Aaron's, there was only ever care. And so there it was. Not an affair, not a living woman, not a secret heart wandering away from our marriage. A dead girl, from before I existed in his life, and a grief almost 20 years old. I sat with that distinction for a long moment in Carol's kitchen, because the difference between those two things is the difference between a marriage that was a lie and a marriage that was true. A living rival would have meant my 13 years were partly counterfeit, that some real share of my husband's heart had always been elsewhere, with a woman he could still have chosen. But a grief is not a rival. A grief does not divide a heart, it deepens one. The Maren I had feared all night, the secret woman, the ongoing love, had never existed. The real Maren was a sorrow Aaron had survived decades ago, and the only thing she was still taking from our marriage was a small space in a drawer. And I sat in Carol's kitchen with the relief and the new ache fighting in my chest, and I asked her the question that mattered most to me. I asked her why Aaron had never told me. And Carol's answer is the thing I have carried with me ever since. She said that Aaron had made a decision, somewhere in our early days, that she had watched him make. He had decided not to bring Maren into our marriage. Not because he was hiding a betrayal, there was nothing ongoing to hide, but because, Carol said, he never wanted me to feel like the second one. He never wanted me to wonder, the way I had been wondering on that closet floor, whether I was a replacement, whether his heart had been given away before I got it, whether I was loving a man who was still partly mourning someone else. He had judged, rightly or wrongly, and I have thought about this endlessly, that the kindest thing he could do for me was to give me a husband who was fully present, and to keep his oldest grief as his own private weather, where it could not cast a shadow over us. He didn't keep Maren a secret because he was being unfaithful to you, Carol told me. He kept her a secret because he was being faithful to you. He didn't want you to spend your marriage competing with a ghost. And I understood, sitting there, that the locket I had found was not evidence against my marriage. It was evidence of how carefully my husband had tried to protect it. And there was something else in what Carol said, something that has stayed with me. She told me that in the early days of Aaron and me dating, she had once gently asked him whether he was going to tell me about Maren, and Aaron had said no. Not out of secrecy, but because, he told his mother, Allie deserves to be loved like she's the only one, not like she's the one who came after. He had decided that the kindest gift he could give me was a clean slate, a husband who arrived in my life without a shrine I would always feel I was standing in the shadow of. I have turned that over 100 times. Part of me wishes he had trusted me with it. Part of me understands exactly why he didn't. But all of me knows now that the silence was never a wall he put between us. It was a shelter he built over me, and I lived inside it for 13 years without ever knowing it was there. I want to be honest about the next part, because relief did not fix everything, and I will not pretend the jealousy simply evaporated. For weeks after, I wrestled with a ghost, because even knowing the truth, a small, ugly voice kept whispering the old questions. Did he love her more? Was she the great love? and I the comfortable one who came after? Was I, in the deepest accounting, the woman he settled into once the woman he truly wanted was gone? I am not proud of those weeks, but I think anyone would have them. I was jealous of a girl who had been dead for nearly 20 years, jealous of someone I could never confront, never measure myself against, never win out over, because she was frozen forever at the perfect, tragic age of a love that never had to survive a mortgage, or a hard year, or the long, ordinary grind that real marriages are made of. How do you compete with a ghost who never got the chance to disappoint anyone? For a while, I could not. And then I found the thing that finally let me put the jealousy down, and it was not in the locket. It was in everything else. I should tell you how ugly it got, because I think the ugliness is honest and worth admitting. There were nights I stood in front of old photographs of Aaron and me, our wedding, vacations, the ordinary happy record of 13 years, and instead of comfort, I felt suspicion. I would study his face in a photo from our honeymoon and think, were you thinking of her, even then? I started to resent a dead girl for the crime of having existed first. I knew, even in the moment, that it was irrational. You cannot betray someone with a love that ended before you met them. But jealousy does not answer to logic. It answers to fear. And the fear underneath all of it was the oldest one there is, that I had not been the great love of my husband's life, that I had been the sensible second chapter, and that somewhere in him, always, the real story had been someone else's. I had to sit in that fear for a while before anything could replace it. Because once I knew about Maren, I started to understand my own marriage differently, and what I understood is the heart of this whole story. Remember the husband I described? The one who noticed things? Who remembered the small stuff? Who treated ordinary Tuesdays like they mattered? Who was almost unusually grateful for our life? Who would stop in the middle of a regular evening just to say he was glad? For 13 years, I had simply thought that was Aaron's personality. A nice quality, the way some people are tall. But sitting with the truth about Maren, I finally saw where it had come from. Aaron loved me the way he did because he had once, at 22, learned in the most brutal way possible exactly how fast a love can be taken. He had held a future in his hands and watched it vanish overnight. And a man who has learned that, truly learned it, does not take a single ordinary Tuesday for granted ever again. The attentiveness, the gratitude, the refusal to waste our days, that was not Aaron being a naturally sweet man. That was Aaron loving me with everything that Maren's death had taught him. The grief that came before me was not my competitor. It was my benefactor. Every good thing about the way my husband loved me had been paid for, in advance, by a loss I never knew about. I went back then to that habit of his. The hand reaching across the table, the quiet, "I'm really glad it's you," announced for no reason on no special day. For 13 years, I had thought it was just a sweet quirk. Now I understood it was a man who knew, in his bones, that the person across the table could be gone by next month, because once she had been. He was not announcing his contentment out of nowhere. He was refusing, every single time, to let an ordinary moment pass without marking that he knew exactly how precious and how fragile it was. That little sentence I used to tease him for was the most profound thing he ever said to me, and I had not understood a word of it. "I'm really glad it's you," was not small talk. It was a man who had buried a future once, making sure he never failed to notice the one he had been given the second time. I want to tell you what that realization did to the jealousy, because it dissolved it completely and replaced it with something I did not expect. Gratitude toward a girl I never met. Maren did not take anything from me. Maren gave me something. Because of her, and because of what losing her did to Aaron, I got 13 years of a husband who knew, at a cellular level, in a way most people are mercifully spared from knowing so young, that love is not guaranteed, that the person across the breakfast table can be gone in weeks, that ordinary life is the actual treasure and not the warm-up to it. And here is where I finally found my way out of the jealousy entirely, because I realized I had been asking a question that had no answer because it was the wrong question to begin with. I had wondered whether I was the second love, the lesser one, but it was the wrong question. You cannot rank two loves that belong to two different people, Because Aaron at 22 and Aaron at 38 were, in every way that matters, two different men. The boy who loved Maren had loved with the whole, weightless, untested heart of someone who did not yet know what loss was. The man who loved me loved with a heart that had been broken and rebuilt, heavier and more knowing. To ask which love was greater is like asking whether the spring is greater than the autumn. They are not competing. They are simply different seasons of the same life, and I had been given the deeper, later one. There was no contest, because the two loves were not even the same kind of thing. Maren was a young man's first, untested, perfect, doomed love. I was the love of the man that grief had made him into, deeper, more grateful, more present, more aware of what he held, precisely because he had once held something and lost it. I was not the consolation prize after Maren. I was the beneficiary of everything her death had taught him about how to love a person while you still have them. Once I understood that, I went looking through the rest of his things differently, not for evidence against my marriage anymore, but for the man I was finally starting to see clearly. And I found small confirmations everywhere. The way he had insisted, every year, on real vacations even when money was tight. "We'll never get this year back," he used to say, and I had thought it was a slogan. The way he refused to go to bed angry, ever, even on the worst nights, even when I wanted to. The way he had wanted children early, sooner than I felt ready, and had been so quietly, fiercely present once we had them. I had read all of it, for 13 years, as simply Aaron's nature. Now I read it as Aaron's knowledge, the hard-won, grief-taught certainty that nothing is promised, that you do not get the year back, that the people at your table are on loan. Maren's death had not made my husband sad. It had made him awake. And I had spent 13 years married to the most awake man I have ever known without ever understanding what had opened his eyes. A year has passed now since I found the locket. I did not get rid of it. For a little while I thought I might, that it belonged to a chapter of Aaron's life that was not mine, that I should return it to Carol or bury it with some memory of Maren. But in the end, I kept it, and I will tell you why. That locket is the reason my marriage was as good as it was. I owe it, and I owe her. So, it sits in my own jewelry box now, the small, worn gold thing that frightened me so badly on a closet floor, and every so often I take it out and hold it, and I feel something toward Maren that I never could have predicted that first terrible night. I feel a strange, quiet kinship with her. We loved the same man, she and I, at the two opposite ends of his life. She had him young and lost him cruelly. I had him grown and lost him too soon. And in between, she taught him how to love me, without either of us ever knowing the other existed. Two widows of the same heart. I do not feel jealous of Maren anymore. I feel like, in some way I cannot fully explain, we are on the same side. I did one thing, a few months ago, that I want to tell you about. With Carol's help, I learned where Maren was buried. It was not far, a town an hour north, and one Saturday I drove there, and I found her stone. And I stood in front of the grave of a girl who had died at 20, nearly 20 years ago, a girl I had spent months being afraid of. And I did not feel jealous standing there. I felt grateful, and I felt sorrow, and I felt a strange tenderness for this young woman who had loved my husband when he was young and bright and unbroken, and who never got to find out who he became. I told her, quietly, that he had turned out to be a wonderful man. I told her that he had been loved, and that he had loved well, and that some of how well he loved had been because of her. I do not know what I believe about whether anyone heard, but I left feeling that a circle had quietly closed, the first woman and the last woman, standing together at last, on the same side of a love that had outlived them both. And I understand my whole marriage more truly now than I did when Aaron was alive. I used to think I had simply gotten lucky, that I had happened to marry an unusually grateful, attentive, present man. Now I know that the gratitude I lived inside for 13 years had a source, and a cost, and a name. Aaron did not come to me as a blank, lucky accident of good temperament. He came to me already taught, already deepened, already broken open once, and healed in a way that made him hold me more carefully than an unbroken man ever could have. The best thing about my husband was a wound, and the locket was the only headstone that wound ever had. I think about that phrase a lot now, the only headstone that wound ever had. Because Maren has a real grave an hour north with her name on a stone. But Aaron's grief for her never had a marker anywhere in his outward life. He had buried it so deep and so privately that no one in his daily world even knew the wound existed. The locket was the single place that grief was ever allowed to be visible, and even then, only in a drawer, only to him, only in secret. For nearly 20 years, my husband carried an unmarked grief, and the locket was its lone, quiet monument. And I cannot help feeling that there is something almost unbearably lonely in that. A man tending a private grave inside himself for 2 decades, telling no one, least of all the wife who would gladly have helped him carry it. If I could change one thing, it would not be that he loved Maren. It would be that he felt he had to mourn her alone. I want to leave you with the 2 things this taught me. The first is for anyone who has ever found, or feared finding, evidence of a love that came before them. When you discover that the person you love loved someone else first, a name in a locket, a face in an old photo, a story you were never told, the mind races straight to the worst reading, that you are second, that you are a replacement, that their real heart was given away before you ever arrived. But I am asking you to slow down before you believe that, the way I wish I had on that closet floor. Everyone you love had a whole life before you. They loved and lost and were shaped by people you will never meet. And that history is not your competition. It is the reason they are who they are. The person you fell in love with is the sum of every love that came before, including the ones that broke them. You are not competing with their past. You are the beneficiary of it. The second thing is gentler, and it is about the griefs the people we love carry quietly. Aaron protected me from his oldest grief for 13 years, out of love, and I have made my peace with that, though I sometimes wish he had trusted me to hold it with him. But the deeper lesson is about what that grief had done to him. The most precious quality in my husband, the way he treasured our ordinary days, was not a gift of personality. It was a scar. So, if there is someone in your life who loves you with a rare attentiveness, who seems to know how fragile and precious it all is, consider that they may have learned it the hard way in a chapter you know nothing about. The people who love best have often grieved worst. Do not envy the losses that shaped them. Be grateful for them. The ghost that haunts the one you love may be the very thing that taught them how to love you. If this story landed for you, drop the word "Locket" in the comments below. I read them. It tells me which stories are worth telling next. Subscribe for new stories, real patterns, full narratives, the long game. 2 small pieces of wisdom from this one before I go. First, the loves that came before you are not your competition. They are your inheritance. When you discover that the person you love loved someone else first, the mind leaps to the cruelest reading. That you are second, a replacement, a consolation. But everyone you love had a whole life before you arrived in it, full of people who shaped them in ways you will never fully see. That history did not steal anything from you. It built the very person you fell for. You are not in a contest with their past. You are standing on it. The one you love is the sum of everyone who came before, and you get the version of them that all of it produced. Second, the people who love you best have often been broken first. The rarest and most precious thing in my marriage, a husband who treasured every ordinary day, turned out not to be a sunny temperament, but a scar, earned in a grief I never knew about. Those who hold love most carefully are frequently the ones who once learned, the hard way, how fast it can vanish. So, if someone loves you with that kind of attentiveness, with a quiet awareness of how fragile it all is, do not envy or resent the losses that taught them. Be grateful for them. The ghost that haunts the one you love may be exactly what taught them how to love you. Do not envy the ghost that taught him how to love you. I'll see you next time.